Well, as we're going to launch a new sermon series next week that's focused on more relevant topics in the faith. And so it's going to be like faith and science, and can you trust the Bible, and is Jesus really God, and all those really controversial questions that for some reason churches don't talk about. We're actually going to do that over the next coming weeks, but this week we're going to do a text from the Bible that almost never gets read. Last week was the least read part of the whole Bible that we focused on, if you were here. That was the genealogies of Jesus that you find in Matthew 1, and you also find it in Luke 3. But today we're going to follow through Matthew into Matthew chapter 2. And the reason why it gets skipped is we have these very few, very precious stories about what Jesus was like between his birth and between when he was an adult, right? Like there's almost nothing in between. Except this is one of those little stories, unlike the one in Luke that talks about when he was in the temple when he was 12. This is one of those special moments where we get to know about what Jesus' life was like after he was born. So here we go. You'll find it on the screen, and I invite you to silently follow along. It says this: After Jesus was born in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time that the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." And after they heard the king, they went on their way. And the star that they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. And on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So the rest of the chapter is pretty interesting, and you can read it on your own time. But you know this story, we say wise men, or have you ever heard the kings and all that? We're going to talk about that a little bit today. We're going to introduce the characters in this story. We're going to start with King Herod, then we're going to talk about Bethlehem, then we're going to talk about who these Magi were, the three kings. Maybe you've heard it before. And then we'll just flush out some spiritual and practical implications from this text for us today. But the first thing that I want to do is introduce you to King Herod. And you'll see a picture of him on the screen. King Herod was the one that they call King Herod the Great. On the left, you'll see a picture of Jerusalem, the temple that he lived in. Some parts are actually still there today. In the bottom little corner is his fortress of Masada that's not very far away, and I've been there. You can walk around it. It's an impressive place. But King Herod the Great was the one who was alive when Jesus was born, and he was ruling over Israel at that point. And it's ironic that they call him the King of the Jews because he wasn't Jewish. Most people don't know that. He was an Edomite. And so he was like this puppet ruler that had been put in charge by Rome to kind of make sure that everything was peaceful in that area. And like all shady rulers, he'd made his compromises and done his bad things. But there's something you need to know about Herod the Great in order to understand the birth of Jesus really, really clearly. And that is, King Herod the Great was the most narcissistic and dangerous ruler you could ever meet. Let me just give you a few examples. They're fun, actually, to think of the examples. The part of the Bible that we didn't read is right after Jesus is born, and he sends the Magi to Bethlehem to go do their thing. One of the things that Herod does is he waits a little bit, but then he gathers his strength. And the text tells us that what happened is then Herod, what he did, after he sent the wise men, says, after they were gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph. And the first thing after Jesus is born is an angel shows up in Joseph's life and sends a dream message to him, which says, hey, you're not safe here. You're not safe. And so after Jesus is born, we don't know exactly when this would have been. It could have been a year after Jesus was born, maybe a few months. No scholar knows this, and the Bible doesn't tell us. And so the idea that the three kings or the three magi showed up the night Jesus was born in all the pictures, probably not the case. But many months later, they show up, and then they get this vibe from Herod that things aren't good. Joseph gets a dream, and the immediate action that God sends to Joseph and to Mary and to baby Jesus is, you need to get out of town now. It is not safe for you to be here. And so they actually flee. They go to Egypt, and they run away. For many years, we mostly think. The Bible doesn't say how long, but Jesus was a refugee running away from his hometown because it wasn't safe. And the reason why it wasn't safe was because of this guy, Herod. Who was Herod? Well, he was the king of the Jews, but he wasn't really the king of the Jews. And he ruled out of total fear. Let me give you a couple of examples. The one in the Bible that we get is he was so afraid that there might be another king. Because remember, they come to Jerusalem, and the first thing that they say is, hey, we're looking for a king. Have you seen him? And of course, they're speaking to the king while they're saying this. What do you think that causes to happen in Herod's heart? Jealousy, anger, fear. And so he has all these emotions stirring up in him, and that's exactly who he was. He's the kind of guy where the second the wise men left a different route, his next action in the scriptures was to send a team of soldiers to Bethlehem, and they murdered every child under 2 years old. He murdered every child under 2 years old in that town. And we don't think it would have been more than maybe like 20, 30, 40 kids. Bethlehem wasn't a large town in those days. But still, could you imagine being the one that sends the email that says, hey, here are your instructions for next week. I need you to walk over to this town and find every little baby without them knowing in advance. Surprise them so they can't run. And I want you to murder every single one of them. That's what Herod did. But that's like who he was. To give you a few more examples that aren't in the Bible that we read about from Josephus and other historians at the time, King Herod the Great, what he did was when he was about to die, he knew everyone hated him so much that no one was going to weep when he died. No one would be sad when he died. In fact, they would probably throw a party and celebrate. And he knew this was going to happen, and so he needed to find a way to make people unhappy. So he had all of the important people in town arrested before he died and put in prison with strict orders that on his death, all of them were murdered as well. Why? So that there would be weeping and mourning when he died. I mean, can you imagine? He had his wife killed. He had several of his wives killed, actually. His own sons he had murdered because he viewed them as threats to the throne. So this is a paranoid, terrible ruler. And when Jesus was born, this guy was 7 miles away from Bethlehem. And so this is a picture of a church in Bethlehem. You'll see it next on the screen. This is a little church of someone bending over. This is the church that's on the site in Bethlehem today where you can go, where they think that it's where Jesus would have been born. You'll laugh. About like 6 months ago, I was like, you know what, I should probably plan a trip to Israel for the church coming up in 2025. Those plans have been set aside. But one of the great privileges of being able to go to these places, you can go to Bethlehem. I remember when I went, one of the things that's unique about Bethlehem is it's in Palestinian territory, not in Israel territory. And so you have to cross through these walls. You'll see a picture. The next picture is actually a picture of the walls where you can see Bethlehem in the distance. So there's a wall today in modern day Israel and Palestine separating between the two places. But that picture that I did just show you is where the entrance to the church is. One of the things I love about that church that's set over the place where Jesus was born was the only way that you can get in it is by crouching down low. It's by crouching down low. So the door to this massive church is ironically tiny. And it's designed to show us that this is how Jesus came into the world. He came with humility. And he bowed down low, and he came to us in a way that didn't have high arches like McDonald's does. It had low arches, because that's who our God is. And here's what I find fascinating. Bethlehem, you can walk there from Jerusalem. It's like 6 miles, 7 miles, depending how you get there. And when you're going to Bethlehem, Herod could have just joined the Magi as they walked over, right? But he doesn't. Instead, he waits and he hides his true intentions because he doesn't want anyone to know that he's jealous and that he has these devious plans to kill any king. Because if you were another kind of king, you were a threat to him. But Bethlehem's just real close. We forget this when we read these stories. These are real places that you can go, places that you can stand. Now, we have zero confidence that any time you go to the Holy Land and you stand in a certain place, that's right where Jesus was. The Bible doesn't tell us those kinds of details. It didn't have GPS coordinates back then either. But we have tremendous confidence of where Bethlehem is and where these places are. And you could have been there if you were alive on that day. And so you know a little bit of who King Herod is now. You know a little bit about Bethlehem. That's not super far away. But by the way, that just means house of bread in Hebrew, which is ironic given that he's the bread for the world, and we'll celebrate communion today. So there's deep connections. When he says that he is the bread of life, that means something. Being born in the house of bread, and that he broke bread at the end of his life for us. And so that's a theme that runs throughout his life. But the last picture that I want to share with you this morning isn't Herod and isn't Bethlehem. It's of the Magi. And this is just a silly picture of the Magi. And the reason why is because we have no pictures of the Magi. But if you are alive today, most likely you've been formed and shaped by that song, "We Three Kings of Orient Are," right? There couldn't be anything more misleading than that song about who these folks were. And it's important that you know that. We don't think that there were three of them. There's nothing in the Bible that says there were three. It just says the Magi. It used to use the phrase wise men or we three kings, it says. They weren't kings. Kings stayed in their places. These were like astrologers. They were probably from Persia. And so modern day Iran would have been their starting location. And they were Zoroastrians, most likely, which was another kind of religion in those days that still exists to this day. But so they were Iranian people. And no one knows exactly how they knew all this stuff, but if you remember all the way back in your Old Testament, Daniel was this amazing young man that was captured and sent off to a foreign land, and he was thrown in the lion's den and all that kind of stuff. Do you remember these stories? Well, there's a very good chance that he was the one, along with all the other Jews that were held in captivity at the same place in Babylon and Assyria and those kinds of places, where they kept the traditions alive. And so it's very likely that these Magi, who we meet in Matthew chapter 2, were influenced by the Jewish population that lived in that foreign land that went back centuries. Maybe Daniel had planted the seed. And so it's a good question. Well, how did they know what this star was and what it meant and who are all these people? There's a very good chance that the Magi had access to the Hebrew Scriptures, were pouring through them, and were looking for a Messiah to come. That's a pretty fascinating thought, right? If you want to, usually this is the time of year where you can go on the History Channel to learn about all these things. They don't know what they're talking about, and they're always guessing. We have no idea how the star appeared, if it was miraculous or not miraculous, or what would have happened. Those are mysterious things to those of us that seriously study the Bible. And the Bible doesn't say how or why or what that all went down. But this is what we know, is that these people who were scholars from far away were sent by their Persian kings to travel all the way. And this would have been a mega trip, by the way. This would have been a serious trip to travel all the way where they followed the star and ended up in King Herod's territory. And they go to him, because, and most likely they would have had 50 people, because there's people carrying their supplies, and there would have been a bunch of them. And here's the ironic thing, is they get there, and the people who should have known everything, and should have been looking the whole time, and were only 6 miles away, had no clue. It was these foreigners from really far away that had wandered 1,000 miles in order to get there, that showed up asking, "Hey, this star, haven't you all seen it?" And they're like, "What? What star?" They're like, "Look." And of course, they're like, "Don't you read your scriptures?" Can you imagine how awkward that conversation would have been? It says that King Herod gathered all of his chief priests and teachers of the law, because he quickly, this is like the President of the United States when they find out something, like, where's all the people we need to call to figure this out? So he gets his dream team think tank together to assess whether or not these crazy Persian astrologers from far away know more about the Bible than they do. And so all this is happening in a big kerfuffle. They go, there's that powerful story where I mentioned to the kids that they bring their gifts. But when they meet baby Jesus, the text tells us something very powerful. It says, they entered the house where the child and the mother and Mary were, and they fell down before him and worshiped him. And then they opened their treasure chest and gave him gifts. How astounding that these folks had never met Jesus, didn't know very much about these things, and they wandered from 1,000 miles. And can you picture the expression on their faces and the status of their heart when they entered into this very, very, very humble barn with no-name people in abject poverty? Mary and Joseph were very poor, if you don't know that. When they go, in another gospel, when they go just a few days later to circumcise him, they don't even have enough money to sacrifice a lamb, which would have been normal. Instead, they just pay for their 2 pigeons. That's a sign of how poor they were. Here you find this child born in a manger with farm animals. And of course, in our minds, we kind of like idealize it like it was a beautiful thing. It wasn't beautiful. It was actually dangerous and scary and cold and smelled like feces. I remember the best dog I ever got was this dog that we got from a rescue shelter. And when we picked her up, she had poop in her ear, and other things. And she ended up being the best dog ever. But what humble circumstances to find something so great in. Imagine you were these people coming from 1,000 miles away, and you're following the star, and it's proclaimed in the scriptures from centuries ago, and you show up, and it's a place you got to duck your head to get in. And the first thing that they do is they get down on their knees, and they go, God, you are amazing. We could not have predicted this. The status of your character revealed in this way of coming is something that we've never seen, and when you hold King Herod in contrast to how Jesus came, you see the difference between the way God works and the way the world works, right? The way the world works is through power and through dominance. And the way Jesus works is through humility and through suffering. And so this is the story that we find, and I just want to end with a couple takeaways that we all can, there's so much we can go into here. All the prophecies and all these things, and I invite you to read your Bibles when you get home. I just want to share with you a couple things as we close this out. The first one is this, is that when Jesus was born, you should know that all the forces of hell gathered to destroy him. When good, when love, when joy, when peace entered the world, the powers of the world viewed that as an extraordinary threat. And if you try to bring love into the world, the reason why most of us don't actually is because what we should expect and can expect, especially if we're following Jesus, is resistance. The second Jesus came into the world, the forces of the world rallied against him to destroy him and kill him. He was forced as a young child. Imagine a mom and a dad if we are judging by the way the world worked at that time, Mary was most likely 13 to 15. Joseph, we don't know. But imagine these kids having this baby in a barn and then having to flee to Egypt for their lives. If you want to be like Jesus and want to follow Jesus with your life, do you expect it to be easy or hard? There was nothing in Jesus' life that was easy. From the very moment that he was born, he was a refugee and chased out of town. The second thing I'll say is this, one takeaway, a spiritual takeaway, is that outsiders are often closer to the faith than insiders. Outsiders are often closer to the faith than insiders. You would think people that know Jesus the most are church people, right? You would think that because they go to church, right? But in this story, we learn very quickly that the chief priests and the leaders and all the teachers of the church and all the people that should have known who Jesus was were the last people to figure it out. And it was people that were far away that didn't know Jesus at all, that weren't even Jewish, that figured out who Jesus was. And they worshiped him way before anyone else. I know a lot of folks that are churchgoers that don't know Jesus. And I know a lot of folks that have been burned by the church, that don't go to church because of how messy church is, that still love him and know him personally. I'm done as a pastor. You should know. I've given this up a long time ago. I'm done as a pastor trying to figure out who's in and who's out. Jesus said, I'll never know anyways. When you get to heaven, there's going to be people there you don't expect, and there's going to be people that you thought would be there that aren't. I'm just hoping that God will keep me humble enough that I get to be one of the people in the back row. Because we have no idea how it all works. And what we do know is there's nothing that you could do as a pew-sitting, giving person that guarantees your place in the kingdom beyond God's grace alone. And here we find these outsiders that often know it better. Jesus, all throughout his ministry, you know this, the people he was harshest on were who? The insiders. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the people that you would have expected to have it all figured out. Jesus was the harshest on them. And so if you know someone who's struggling with their faith, that doesn't go to church, that's got all these hurts, habits, and hang-ups and things going on in their life, there's a solid chance that somewhere deep inside they have what the Magi had, which was this hunger and real relationship to know Jesus, even though they know the church is messy. So don't give up on people. And don't think you have a privileged status if you're in. Number 3, they gave themselves before they gave their gifts. We talked about this with the kids. What's the one thing that Jesus didn't have before he made the world? Remember this, God had everything. God could snap his fingers and make anything that he wants. But when he made you and I, what he did is he made us in his image. And part of what that means is that you and I have some sort of independence and autonomy to be able to make choices. And that's a very controversial thing in our day and age. But the big point that I want to make is you can't have love unless you have freedom. Because if I wanted people to love me and I was God, what would you do? You would just make them robots. Hey, I want my perfect family. How do I do it? Well, the last thing that I do is I give my teenagers freedom. Right? That's the dangerous strategy. A horrible strategy, if you want things to go perfectly, is to give people freedom. But freedom is who God is. And love is only possible when it's free, because you can't make somebody love you. And therefore, God went into this crazy plan of saying, I'm going to give people freedom so that they'll love me. But they also have the freedom to what? Reject him. What a dangerous plan. And here we see in this little story, the vision that God had for the world is that people would catch a glimpse of God's beauty and his righteousness and his justice and all those good things. And the response would be, I freely give this to you. Right after church today, we have our very first confirmation class of the year, which is kind of cool. And what the reason why we have a confirmation class is, it isn't because we think that 7th graders now are free to make all the best decisions in their life. Right? I'm 43. I'm still not able to really do that. It's because we realize that when we baptize little ones, that's great, that's okay. But there's nothing that you can do to someone that makes you love them. There has to be a point, whether it's in 2nd grade, 7th grade, senior high, college, and for some of us, it's the day before we die, where you have to look yourself in the eye and say, what do I want? That's what confirmation is. It's, I want to give my life to Jesus and follow him. Number 4, pay attention to dreams and God speaks to you. We didn't read this part, but what happens after the Magi leave secretly is God comes to Joseph in a dream and says, you need to go. You know, when I am in Ohio, I've not once heard someone say God spoke to me in a dream. But when I lived in Miami, where our whole church was Latin American, you should know that dreams were normal down there. And I actually had people knock on my door and send me emails saying they'd like to discuss a dream that they had and wanted to know if that was God speaking or not. Maybe that has happened to you or not, but here's what I would ask you to do. Did you know that God still speaks? He still speaks. The difference is sometimes you listen and sometimes you don't. And often when I hear God nudging me or directing me in different ways, my natural inclination is to always say, I'm busy? That's not comfortable? No. Wait, that's when Jen asked me. No, just teasing. But honestly, God comes, can you imagine God coming to Joseph and saying, hey, Joseph, I know you got this newborn, and I know you're getting cozy, and I know you just went to IKEA and built this thing, but it's not safe, and I need you to go. If I was Joseph, I would have said, man, I think we can hang tight. We'll be okay. And instead what he does is he hears God speak, and then he does the thing most of us don't do. He does it. Friends, the most powerful thing you can do in your life is actually say yes when God asks you to do something. You'll find blessing in your life. You'll find that the hard thing is the good thing. And that when Jesus picked up the cross to go to the cross and die for our sins, it was actually the best thing that he could have ever done. And you'll find that when you pick up your cross too, you'll find more freedom than you could ever imagine. The last takeaway is this. I could go on for a very long time, and I'm very sorry. Have compassion on refugees. Have compassion on refugees. Now, Jesus, when he was born, he was a baby, and his mom and dad were forced. They didn't ask to do this, to flee for their lives to a foreign land. And when they got to Egypt, there most likely were a bunch of Jews that were already there in a community as a diaspora that had settled there. But they also, at the same time, were living in a brand new place. They had nothing more than what they could carry on their back. Thank God for those magi who gave them some gold so they could pay for their way. And by the time they get down there, they don't know anyone, and they're living in a foreign land, and they're asking, what school do we put Jesus in? Joseph's a carpenter. He couldn't even carry any of his tools. And so they're living in a foreign land, in a foreign language, in a foreign culture. They can't speak or do anything. They don't have, maybe their green cards aren't working. We have no idea how it worked, but I do know this, that would have been terrible. I remember when I lived in Germany and was studying there, and this was as good as it could get for a foreigner. I mean, it's really tough to live in a foreign land. You miss Der Dutchman. All the comforts of home. I'm just teasing. I went there once. This is the last time I'll go. It was terrible. Not good for this. All the comforts of home were gone, and they were in a foreign land. And don't get me wrong, in our country, there's a crisis with this right now, and the politicians, like always, need to get their act together and figure something out because it's a disaster. But always have mercy on people. Jesus was one of them. And when you see a hurting mom and a hurting dad and a hurting child, one of the things that you do if you're a Christian is you forget everything you ever thought and you love. And that's a hard thing to do. These are just a few of the takeaways that you could learn from this text. But my encouragement to you is that you actually go home and read it for yourself and pray over it and think to yourself, God, how do you want to shape me by reading this today? Will you bow your heads and pray with me? God, we thank you for this story about Jesus' humble birth and for all the things that it has to teach us. Would you continue to shape us, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen.